The protagonist never thought that his request for a raise would result in his beautiful boss promising to pay him $1,000,000,000. But Deputy Steve's life seemed to be turned upside down when he was offered a sham marriage for a lot of money. Work was in full swing at the trade partners distribution company, but colleagues still found time to talk. They were discussing the executive director they saw in the office. Her name was Miss Eliza Evans. Meeting her was like meeting a celebrity, even though she was incredibly beautiful, but one mustn't forget that she was still confronted by her half-brother. And recently, people are increasingly switching to his side. From the very moment the chief chairman's wife died, Director Evans was treated like dead weight in the company, despite the fact that she is the legitimate heir. She was pushed aside by her illegitimate son. Steve, Eliza's deputy and personal secretary, sat nearby, overhearing the ridiculous gossip in the open office. He was just filling out the paperwork, irritated to think that his colleagues were talking about it loudly on purpose so that the director's secretary could hear. The man had been working at Trade Partners for 8 years already. At first, everyone called him a promising employee, but as soon as he started poking his nose into management matters, he was appointed to the position of secretary to the executive director, Eliza Evans, in the distribution department. Judging by the rumors, her situation leaves much to be desired, which means that Steve's career is most likely already over. Having plunged into heavy thoughts, the man did not immediately realize that his colleague had been calling him for several seconds. As it turns out, the director wants to see his deputy before leaving. Steve, as required by his superiors, went to see Eliza, who wanted to see him. The girl was sitting in a chair, obviously looking through documents, which is what the secretary found her doing, but Eliza invited him in. There was something that needed to be discussed. It was then that the turning point came, when the boss proposed marriage to her deputy in exchange for a large sum of money. Steve swallowed hard, looking at the girl in bewilderment, at first thinking that he had misheard. There was silence for a few seconds before the man asked again what Eliza had said, not believing his ears. The girl clicked her tongue because Steve knew very well how much she hated it when people pretended they hadn't heard the first time. She walked around her desk and stood directly in front of the secretary, folding her arms across her chest. For a moment, her interlocutor felt ashamed. Steve put his hand on his chest, saying that he knew about his boss's serious nature and therefore decided to ask again if she was joking. Eliza frowned, pushing a strand of hair out of her face and shaking her head. This further surprised her deputy, who was extremely serious about such a matter, which was the last thing he expected from the always businesslike Eliza. She raised an eyebrow, saying that with that kind of money in the account, her deputy could live his entire life doing whatever he wanted without worrying about earning a living. The girl also added that she was ready to give him such an opportunity, shaking the check in front of his face. Steve was embarrassed, sweating, and nervous because he didn't get such a strange offer every day. Eliza will pay the first $5 billion first, and the rest will be paid when the divorce papers are signed. In addition, she promised the man generous compensation for all his expenses on marriage and image maintenance. But there was one important condition. During this time, Steve had no right to drag his boss into any scandals. He blushed, trying to object or at least add something, but Eliza did not let him say a word. She asked if the secretary knew the state of affairs in the company, since everyone was sure that the girl had failed after her brother came onto the scene. Steve remained silent and listened attentively, deciding that he needed to hear all the arguments. If Eliza doesn't improve her position in the company, she'll just have to watch as everything that belongs to her is stolen. The girl pulled herself up on her hands, then landed deftly and gracefully on the surface of the table. She wanted to do something provocative, something that would remind shareholders and the public that Eliza was the true heir to Trade Partners. The boss thoughtfully said that she needed support for this. Such news would attract attention for a long time. Now Steve clearly felt like a bargaining chip, a dish that they wanted to serve up to society to be torn apart. But Eliza was delighted with her plan. There might be gossip, but there was definitely some sense to it. She couldn't just watch President Martin Evans take everything from her. She couldn't just give in and give in. Yes, Steve could understand exactly that, but he absolutely could not comprehend why Eliza had chosen her. The girl suddenly smiled and shrugged her shoulders. Wasn't it obvious that the secretary was the most unexpected match? Someone who would run to her boss without hesitation when she needed it. Eliza was somehow very affectionate. She wouldn't want to lose someone as wonderful as Steve. Even if he refused such an offer, Eliza wanted him to stay by her side for as long as he could. She now looked like an ordinary person, not a tough boss, smiling so radiantly and simply saying that she couldn't survive here without Steve. At the end of this strange day, the man decided to visit the bath complex. Nothing refreshes the head like taking a bath. Steve plunged into the hot water several times, then emerged, smoothing his hair. He wanted to distract himself, but all his thoughts stubbornly returned to the conversation and money. A whole $10 billion, he certainly couldn't save that amount even in his entire life. The man was imagining with all his might what he could do if he actually got the money. And it's not illegal, and it's not a scam, so why is Steve hesitating? Water slowly trickled down the man's chin into the bathtub in hot drops. He felt like a small grain of sand in the bottomless ocean of life. After all, it was not an easy decision. Steve closed his eyes tightly, thinking that if he agreed he wouldn't be able to date other women. On the other hand, divorce is not such a difficult matter in the modern world. But what should a man feel anyway? Does a wedding with a director mean nothing to him? He needs to find the strength within himself and agree. The next day, Eliza and Steve were getting ready for a business trip, and the girl hoped that she would get along with the secretary. The girl walked forward, the secretary slowed down slightly, watching her thoughtfully. When they boarded the plane, Steve asked if he needed to fly business class. Eliza rolled her eyes since she needed the deputy for work, so he would be nearby. Moreover, the girl took the man his favorite coffee, drawing attention to this. He was stunned and thanked her shyly, surprised to himself that his boss knew about his preferences. Eliza noticed the other person's reaction and smiled, saying that she should definitely know. All these factors seemed to predetermine the man's final decision. The work week began. Steve carefully knocked on the director's door. The girl sat at the table and worked with documents, distractedly inviting the secretary. She fell silent and no longer paid attention to the man, immersed in studying the work processes. However, Steve decided not to distract Eliza from her work and simply sat down on the sofa. On the other hand, he came to announce his decision and therefore immediately announced that he agreed. The girl, who had been acting withdrawn and not even looking at the secretary, immediately looked up and smiled radiantly. But Steve wasn't going to agree so easily. He had one condition for the manager. The smile didn't leave Eliza's face. On the contrary, she easily agreed to listen to the secretary. A little later, the girl arrived for a meeting with the heads of the trade partners company. She waited patiently for the serious men to respond to her statement. Trade Partners Chairman Tom Evans, a wiry man in his 40s, pursed his lips and looked at Eliza silently. The former chairman of the company, George Evans, much older than everyone present, did not believe what the girl said at first. Steve was also present in the office, and now the chairman's question about whether he really intended to marry Eliza was addressed to him. George carefully studied the employee's biography, saying out loud that the future newlyweds were the same age. Steve's only relative was his mother, and his father died when he was in high school. The chairman looked up at the man, reading that he had studied Spanish at the university's foreign languages department. When there was silence, Steve explained that his father worked as a navigator for a long time. Every time he returned from a voyage, he brought his family foreign currency and stamps, which gave birth to his son's dream of becoming a traveler, which is why he decided to study languages. George Evans raised an eyebrow, asking with irony in his voice if Steve wanted to become a traveler. The man, however, did not deny it and answered in the affirmative. A few more seconds of silence passed, and the chairman asked how many dollars Steve had in his account now and whether he even knew what was most important in business and what happened to those who were lost in fantasy. He suddenly crumpled the documents he was holding in his hands, sternly saying that such people were missing out on great opportunities in the present. But the chairman's face changed when Steve announced that he had $10 million in his account. The current chairman jumped up in surprise, looking sharply at the man. Even Eliza didn't expect this when she heard that Steve had saved up this entire amount during his 8 years of working for the company. Funds, cryptocurrency, real estate, none of this ever interested their employee. and Steve never had any fantasies that this would help him get rich. The senior chairman's opinion changed abruptly. He smoothed out the papers and put them on the table. The man asked how much money in foreign currency his father had left him, and he replied that at that time he had received 250 euros by exchanging dollars. George was surprised and asked what all this meant and why the donated funds had to be changed. As it turned out, Steve had to change all this money to cover the costs of studying at a university abroad. 250 euros is $260 at today's exchange rate. For Steve, this money was his father's last gift. He used it to achieve his dream, which he does not regret at all. The former chairman listened attentively to the man and did not interrupt him. He then asked Eliza to return to work and also told the manager, Chris, to stop by to see him on his way back. When Chris arrived, the former chairman asked the manager to hire a new secretary for Eliza. He was also supposed to announce that a new director for the European direction would be appointed within a week. Tom was beside himself, asking his father if he was really going to accept these terms. He couldn't believe that George actually approved of this marriage. The old man shook his head in irritation, reminding her that Eliza was Tom's daughter, not his. Whether to marry or not is her decision, but whether to approve of it is her father's decision, because George can't decide everything for him, can he? Tom asked, puzzled, why the company then needed a new European director. The father asked his son if he saw how the invited guy was trembling, but the man again did not understand what was being said. It seemed that Steve was looking into his eyes and speaking openly. This is exactly what the former leader liked, because there are few people here who can talk to him like that. The old man grinned as he asked his son how many of those he thought there were in the company. He seemed delighted with his granddaughter's actions, as 3 years and 3 months had passed. Yet Eliza had been secretly raising such a ferocious wolf cub all this time. Tom convinced George that they needed to find a new secretary as soon as possible and find out more about Steve. Let the son start with the kimbap shop his mother owns, then check to see if the boy has any problematic close relatives, and find out who he has dated before. With a barely audible groan, the former leader rose from the table. He had asked his son to find a good groom for his daughter. Now he could figure it out himself. This guy is already 34. He is not young. For the good of the company, it is enough that Martin married for convenience. But Tom absolutely did not want such a fate for his beloved granddaughter. If a celebrity serves time and is released and then simply orders fried chicken, there will be a lot of buzz, and everyone will start thinking they look like a celebrity. Ordinary citizens will say that they are, after all, the same people. According to the former leader, this was a pitiful consolation, although if people encourage themselves like this, then it's nothing. If one fried chicken can change public opinion, then how will Eliza's wedding affect those around her? George wanted to object to his father, but he shook his head. The girl said that this man was dear to her. The old man glanced to the side, slyly muttering that he needed to see what the boy was capable of. And at the same time, you can see whether Eliza is good at understanding people or not. According to the rules of the competition, everyone should have equal conditions, always. Giving Eliza what she asks for is fair, but that is how she will be able to realize her mistakes in the future. The next morning, a colleague called out to Steve in the office, and he immediately turned around. But the man did not expect to see this person, so he was surprised. The head of the department, Ben, stood in front of him with a rather serious look, holding several folders under his arm. Steve asked if something was wrong, and it turned out he was supposed to be contacted about his job. Although the secretary was not informed, Chris, the manager, should contact him soon. The interlocutor said that from now on he was appointed deputy director of Eliza, so Steve should hand over the affairs to him immediately. Before Steve could answer, Eliza's stern voice could be heard from behind them. She had heard the conversation and was asking whose order it was. It's unclear how the girl's heels didn't anticipate her appearance, but she didn't look too pleased with what she heard. Ben immediately bowed, saying he was pleased to meet the executive director, and introduced himself as the head of the secretarial department from the strategic planning team. Eliza nodded and also gave her name, saying that she was pleased to meet him. She added that she heard the conversation and did not understand what was happening, since the director did not ask for anyone to be sent to her. Ben was confused and nervous, muttering that it was the group leader. The girl immediately realized that this was an order from her grandfather. Steve looked down when Eliza asked what her deputy would do now. She frowned, adding coldly whether he would sit and do nothing. Ben stuttered as he understood it, saying the man had been transferred to the reserve unit. The boss nodded. How could that be? He was her employee, and nothing was known about the transfer. Even if it's Grandpa's order, it feels like he's ignoring it. Ben became even more nervous and didn't know what to answer, because this was already an internal family squabble. However, Eliza said that everything was fine and called the manager herself. She told him that she had met the head of the secretarial department, Ben, who came to her and said that from today he would take over the duties of her secretary. The man opened his mouth, almost trembling with fear, and the girl continued that she understood her grandfather's order. But it was still clearly worth finding out her opinion on this matter. Many questions arise when a person suddenly appears demanding that responsibilities be given to him. In any case, it was necessary to warn Eliza by phone first, but since that was what her grandfather wanted, she couldn't just refuse. Steve watched Eliza pace back and forth while she talked on the phone, and he knew the CEO was 100% right about this situation. The girl hung up, biting her lips thoughtfully, then turned to her boss, Ben. She asked if he had contacted Deputy Steve to tell him the news, or if he had decided to tell him after the fact. At that moment, the man was openly trembling. All thoughts had flown out of his head, and he began to mumble incoherently. Eliza said coldly that even if it was the chairman's order, she could not trust the place next to her to someone who could not make even a simple decision on his own. And the final shot was that the girl ordered Ben to get lost right now. It was a pity to look at the man. He looked so confused and depressed. When he left, Eliza smiled and asked Steve to have lunch with her, since the secretary loved sashimi. He swallowed hard, surprised by his boss's knowledge, and nodded. An hour later, the colleagues were already in an expensive restaurant. Nimble waiters quickly brought delicious dishes to the table. Between meals, Eliza placed the marriage contract on the table with the intention of examining it closely during dinner. It was prepared by a lawyer, so notarization is not required. After a short silence, Eliza suddenly changed the subject for a few minutes. She told Steve that she was amazed by the way he talked to his grandfather. The man was surprised that he was called fearless. He himself felt that his heart was ready to jump out of his chest. Eliza laughed, assuring him that it had been more than impressive at the time. Her deputy also chuckled, slightly nervously, taking out sheets of paper from the folder. He carefully read what was written, but something in particular caught the man's attention. Steve turned one document toward Eliza, noting a strange clause. It stated that the future chosen one does not claim parental rights or custody of the children. Grandfather told his granddaughter about this just in case it was necessary to get Steve's consent in advance. According to the agreement, the couple will marry and then divorce, so this clause is needed to avoid any disputes over parental rights and custody. Eliza simply added whatever she could think of and asked her interlocutor how it made any difference. Steve replied that that wasn't the issue. He just hoped that this clause wouldn't cause any unexpected problems. The girl asked excitedly whether the secretary could refuse the deal because of this. Steve didn't mean it that way. He meant that he wanted to reconsider that point. Eliza suggested that Steve wanted to increase the amount of compensation for denial of parental rights or custody. She was surprised when her secretary shook his head because she was sure that everyone only wanted money. Even if he gives up parental rights, does he still want one? Spend as much time as possible with your intended child. Eliza remained silent. Steve added that the child obviously had not done anything wrong. But this part, if the executive director agrees, the man certainly won't worry. Eliza shared the secretary's opinion, assuring him that he shouldn't worry. So, by agreement of the parties, the necessary documents were stamped. The girl added that the money had been transferred to the man's account and that she had completed all the necessary procedures. Steve confirmed the transfer of a large sum. He thought that if he received $5 million, he would feel like the master of the world, but he simply doesn't believe it yet. The boss asked about the position of director of the European branch in Chicago, and whether there was any reason why Steve wanted this position. The man replied that this was not trade partners' main focus, that all other attention would be directed at the executive director, and that the girl was planning to use the secretary as a weapon. In that case, she needs to place Steve where he could become that weapon. Eliza nodded. Busy eating, she understood what the interlocutor was talking about. While he waits for his appointment, let this be a short vacation for him and an opportunity to visit his family. That's what Steve did. He went to see his mother for a few days, and while sitting in the car, he thought about what to tell her. However, he has no need to justify himself to others. Until now, he has done everything in his power. And what he ended up getting in return was that the man's achievements were appropriated by directors who, he thought, were on his side. Steve stayed up nights for months working on this important project, but they simply did not support the young employees' initiatives. Moreover, these bastards wrote their names on it and threw Steve out. They were promoted from deputy to department head and are now receiving huge annual salaries. These bastards are living the high life, so why should Steve cower in a corner and refuse the prenuptial agreement? The man kept his eyes on the road, but that didn't stop him from thinking about the future. His mother is not one of those people. Everything is different with her, and he needs to think about how to explain everything. Steve made his decision. His mother would be one of those for whom this marriage would be the most real. When the son arrived, he brought his mother the traditional chicken that they ate at every meeting. The woman looked tired as she worked behind the store counter, but she perked up when she saw her son. She was surprised, asking what had gotten into Steve, since he had to go to work tomorrow, and he replied that he had gotten the day off. When the son asked his mother to sit down and rest, she just laughed. That wouldn't work with business. She'd be done soon. Let him wait a little. The woman asked if her child had received another promotion, and he proudly replied that he had. He didn't lie. It was the best thing to do, and besides, this time the increase was very significant. This was the best way to convince my mother and make her happy. Steve reminded me of the company he worked for. The chairman of that company had already offered to work with him several times. Mom, taking a sip of beer, remarked that the company was very influential. Steve reminded her that he had previously worked for the executive director, so he often saw the chairman. The woman shook her head. Her son was communicating with people she had only seen on TV. She couldn't even believe that Steve could meet them in person. Steve waved his hand. They were the same people as everyone else, nothing special. While the mother was eating, the son decided to tell her something else important. Slightly nervous, the man said that there was a girl he would like to introduce. The mother's face elongated with happiness, and she immediately forgot about the food she was eating. She beamed. Steve rolled his eyes, asking that nothing too important had happened. And the mother was very happy that her son had a girlfriend. She asked how long ago the children got together, and if she was pretty. When Steve said that his mother already knew her, the woman suggested that it was Nikki, whom he dated at university. But it was all a mistake, because the girl was already married and had 2 children. The mother frowned and sighed, not understanding who else it could be, who she knew. She narrowed her eyes at her son, who was slowly drinking his beer, and urged him to speak up and not delay any further. Steve slammed the jar down on the table, trying hard to collect his thoughts. The beautiful director immediately appeared before him. The girl, as always, smiled at him. So, in order not to drag out the intrigue even further, Steve answered with an exhalation that his girlfriend is the executive director from work. The mother, who was carrying a piece of chicken to her mouth, was stunned, dropping the food on the table. She stared at her son in shock and asked who he was talking about, but he retorted that he hadn't talked about many executive directors. The mother was amazed that they were talking about the executive director, Eliza, the one whose deputy her son was. She looked utterly confused, remembering that the girl's grandfather was the chairman of the company. The woman bit her lip, carefully asking if the boss and subordinate loved each other. It was hard for Steve to lie to his mother, but he pulled himself together and even managed to smile and nod. Raising an eyebrow, Mom asked if they loved each other, not just as colleagues, but as individuals, and if they shared each other's feelings. Steve agreed with everything that was said, adding that that was why he wanted to introduce the girl to his mother. The woman lost her appetite, stirring her food with chopsticks. She was really surprised. After all, her son is dating a rather important person and one with such a pedigree. Steve smiled, but he still didn't quite understand what his mother was really feeling, and asked why she had such a strange expression on her face. She nevertheless put the cutlery on the table, saying that she was really worried. Steve didn't understand the reasons. The woman asked how Eliza's family reacted. The man decided to lie again, saying that both the former and current chairman laughed at first. The former chairman was at an advanced age and was naturally happy to hear that his own granddaughter had found her life partner. Having said that the chairman liked him, Steve clinked cans of beer with his mother. He smiled, adding that it was clearly for this reason that he kept him as a secretary for his daughter for more than 3 years. The mother took a sip, asking if the chairman had always thought so highly of Steve. He replied that the man was very surprised at first, but after a conversation he accepted him. This also concerns the transfer to the trading company. No matter how well he performed his duties, Steve could never rise above the vice director. The chairman does all this because he believes that the secretary will be a worthy match for his daughter. The mother put the can of beer on the table and wondered what to say to her son. Finally, she reminded that it happens even if a celebrity becomes part of a family with a rich pedigree. They will speak foreign languages to come and look down on their chosen one, simply because he was born into a simple family. Steve recalled that he graduated from a foreign language university in another country, and no one in this family could compete with him in language skills. The woman exclaimed with despair in her voice that she had not been talking about that at all. The man shook his head, saying that his mother had not raised him that way. Because firstly, he will not allow anyone to bully him, and secondly, he won't allow anyone to look down on him. That's how his mother raised him. Steve smiled, adding that the Evans were a good family, and his mother really shouldn't worry about it. The woman swallowed hard and shook her head once again, taking a sip of beer. After dinner, Steve lay in bed, unable to sleep, and decided to write to Eliza. His heart was pounding as he typed, asking for forgiveness for writing so late. The girl was not yet asleep. She had just come out of the shower when she heard her mobile ringing. Having decided to see who was writing to her at such a time, Eliza's eyes widened in surprise. Steve mentioned in the correspondence that there was one detail that made it better to postpone signing the contract. His mother was very worried about the wedding. Eliza held her breath, asking if the secretary had told her everything, but he said no. She admitted to being momentarily frightened and breathed a sigh of relief. Steve guessed that the director would be surprised when he heard the whole conversation and asked if the girl could help dispel doubts about the wedding. Eliza surprisingly agreed, and moreover said that she was obliged to help with this. The man waited a little longer, but there were no more messages. He assumed that the boss had fallen asleep. A few minutes later, she sent a photo of the handwritten sentence on the contract. Steve read what was written, where Eliza promised to help him in official language. The girl added that this should become a performance that she will approach seriously and play her role. Steve was surprised because the girl sent a silly, smiley face, which was completely out of character for her. She was already in bed when she said goodbye to her deputy and smiled at his messages. The phone fell out of her hands after the girl said goodnight to Steve and immediately fell asleep. The next morning, the man woke up early and immediately went to the shower. His mother was already awake, preparing breakfast. She asked her son when he left, but he himself did not know. At that moment, the phone rang. The man interrupted the conversation and approached the table. Steve was surprised, didn't expect to see this name on the screen, but picked up the phone. The voice on the phone said he was the deputy, and the man asked what the call was about. It turned out that the president of the trading company, Michael Jordan, wants to meet with the man before the official announcement of his appointment. Steve said that he went out of town to visit his mother. Meeting in the morning would be problematic, but it would be possible after lunch, around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The person on the other end of the line said they would pass on the message to the president, and the guy thanked the caller. When he thought the conversation was over, the man wanted to ask something. It was a personal curiosity. Steve even went out onto the balcony to talk. He was asked why they didn't tell him about the act they had committed when Steve was working in a trading company with another director, Robert Johnson, and why they didn't tell him after he left the company. George had just received information about the foreign branch in Madrid, Spain, one of the richest enterprises of the Mulsanne company. The old man asked in surprise if this was really the project of Steve, his granddaughter's deputy. The oil sales project became the most successful business in the European direction of the Osaka Group. To begin with, they opened a small office in Granada and entered into contracts with olive farms in Andalusia. From the olives from the farms, they produced premium oil, which they successfully exported all over the world. Due to the success of this project, John Wilson was promoted to deputy senior manager. Robert Johnson was then promoted straight to senior manager, and last year to department head. George listened attentively to his son as he told him this and encouraged him to continue. His son was surprised that such trifles interested the former leader. It seems Deputy Steve introduced this project immediately after he was promoted to assistant chief at Mulsanne. In this case, we can consider that this project was first presented 5 years ago. From his own experience, the former chairman understood that this was too big a project for a person in such a position. He tapped his finger on the documents because he knew Eliza's character well and how she knew everything, but did not interfere. It is worth considering that the director joined the trading company after they had already pulled everything off, but it turned out that the girl joined after the project had already begun. George asked his son if Eliza really didn't know anything since Tom had worked for her for 3 years and hadn't told her. Deputy Steve always keeps his mouth shut, but the old man knew the man was just playing dumb. He smirked. Something told the former chairman that Eliza had lied to him. She suggested transferring the deputy to that company, saying that it was her idea. But from everything George heard, it was clear that this was Steve's own idea. The head of the family asked if there was anything else about his personal life and family. Tom shook his head. The secretary was absolutely clear. Robert Johnson, who is currently the head of the department, needs to be transferred to Cheonggi. Otherwise, the money is going down the drain. Steve muttered thoughtfully about why he hadn't told anyone, as he was about to answer. Everyone who worked on the project even a little knew about this, but nevertheless, no one talked about it. Steve was asked if the CEO knew about it, but as it turned out, she joined the company after everything had already happened. The man would like to believe that Eliza knew nothing. The voice on the phone cryptically suggested the reason for Steve's transfer to trade partners, but his interlocutor confirmed that it was simply a promotion. For a job he can handle without causing problems for the CEO, this company is the best option. The deputy director stated that he had already reported this to the senior chairman. Steve didn't understand what was going on, but he was told that the head of the department, Robert Johnson, had already been transferred to Cheonggi as ordered by the senior chairman after he learned about everything. Moreover, it is generally accepted among the leaders that a transfer to Cheonggi is tantamount to exile. Steve began to think that the group leader Chris had given him a hint. Robert Johnson and John Wilson treated a man horribly when he was an assistant manager in a trading company. And the senior representative found out about all this, of course, in all the details. The fact that Robert Johnson was transferred to Cheonggi says a lot. If Steve goes back to that company and pretends nothing happened, it will look like he's just another puppet. It's clear that Robert will be sent to Cheonggi before Steve takes up his position. Until that happens, Steve needs to say goodbye to him properly. The man had no choice but to ask that the president of the trading company, Michael Jordan, be told that he would meet with the manager at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And if possible, SciTV also wanted to review the records of the European division staff before he officially took up his position. Steve said goodbye to his mother and on the way back contacted Eliza, informing her that he was returning to New York. The girl asked why he spent so little time with his family, and the subordinate explained that the president of the trading company, Michael Jordan, wanted to meet with him. Eliza asked what time the meeting was and learned that the secretary would arrive at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The girl asked her subordinate to come to her after meeting with President Jordan. She wanted them to come to her right after the meeting, but Steve insisted on a specific time. The future newlyweds talked a little more while the man was on the road. Finally arriving at the place, the secretary said goodbye to the director. They planned to meet at 5. Steve hung up, staring blankly at the phone's blank screen for a moment. A swarm of thoughts was present in my head, and now I needed to calm down in order to meet with the president of the trading company. Steve was gathering his thoughts as he stood in front of the tall, beautiful building where the office was located. The man walked inside and hurried to the elevator, which was already leaving. He asked him to wait, and the girl at the aisle kindly pressed the button to open the doors. In such a small space, everyone always felt awkward. Fortunately, this torture did not last long. A few more minutes passed, and Steve finally arrived at the right floor in an open office. He approached the tables where there was a sign indicating the European direction, and one of the employees asked what brought the man there. Steve said hello and replied that he came from the secretarial department, noting his badge. Several people standing behind him became animated and began whispering. Steve overheard people talking about him. His colleagues were gradually starting to recognize their deputy. At first it was assumed that the deputy had left on a business trip yesterday, but the speaker was corrected. The deputy from the Spanish direction arrived here. The same Deputy Steve who was recently promoted from the secretarial team to Deputy Director Eliza Evans. Someone called out to the man and he froze, immediately recognizing the hated voice. The speaker exclaimed that they hadn't seen each other for a long time and asked if Steve had arrived with the CEO. Steve slowly looked over his shoulder. He finally saw the traitor, John Wilson. At their last meeting, the men had an argument, and the deceived employee shouted that he had developed the project. Steve was rightly indignant, asking with incredible resentment in his voice why his name was not there. Moreover, the name of Robert Johnson was indicated on the project instead of his. John looked at his subordinate with disgust, saying that the deputy was already well paid for such a position. What else did he want? What he heard seemed to hit Steve on the head. This was not what he had expected for all his efforts. Wilson shook his head, spitting out that everything was as usual. Apparently, American conglomerates hadn't changed a bit. Subordinates are there to help their superiors achieve good results, so let the guy grit his teeth and work hard. The man rolled his eyes, mockingly asking what projects Steve had worked on for that division. Each of the company's projects stands out among dozens and hundreds of others, but only those that management has recognized as potentially successful are brought to life. Steve is paid to do a certain job, so he must do only that job. John looked his subordinate up and down, asking if he really didn't understand how it worked, since he thought Steve was smart, but he turned out to be such a fool. Steve listened silently to all the insults and felt as if a wave of black swamp was covering him. All his efforts had gone to the bottom. And now this shameless man was smiling in his face, saying that he had just recently remembered him and wanted to find out something, because they were on the same wavelength and understood each other perfectly. Wilson put his hand on Steve's shoulder, asking if he knew about the new department head who had been transferred from the main office, as the atmosphere there was a bit tense due to the change in management. Steve just narrowed his eyes, piercing the man with a murderous look, and didn't answer. Instead, he asked Wilson where Jacob Prue was now. He shook off the stranger's hand from his shoulder and forcefully repeated the question that the Secretariat was interested in. At that moment, a tall man approached them and asked with interest why the Secretariat needed him. Steve turned to say hello. John Wilson was still furious at the rude treatment. Deputy Manager Jacob Prue was just stepping away to get a glass of legitimate coffee. It was worth going back to the time when two bastards, Robert Johnson and John Wilson, excluded Steve from the Spanish team. The man remembered that at that time, Jacob was the only elder who approached him. Steve was in an incredibly depressed state and seemed oblivious to everyone around him when the man playfully called him over. He smiled at Steve, offering to have a drink after work. A drunk Steve dared to tell his elder brother that if he continued to behave like this, he would end badly. Jacob ate quietly while he was told that associating with someone like Steve was unlikely to do him any good. When his interlocutor fell silent, Prue placed the empty shot glass on the table and looked seriously at the junior employee. He poured more alcohol, saying that life is not a solitary journey, and offered another drink. Steve muttered something unintelligible and quickly held out his shot glass. Jacob shrugged, declaring that he didn't care about all this nonsense, and smiled broadly. This guy, he joined the company 6 months before Steve, worked well and was a smart leader, but it's strange why, with such data, he sat in the position of deputy manager for 5 years. The reason was obvious, and now Jacob greeted Steve, the deputy from the Secretariat, with delight. He chuckled, saying that time was not only kind to him, his deputy looked even younger and wealthier than before. Steve smiled back, and how come it was only his older friend who had aged? The man chuckled, saying he wanted to know, and asked what brought Steve here, and he replied that he had come to evaluate the senior's performance in the company. Jacob looks back, saying it would be a sin to leave such a good job. The courage to not be favored, the determination to turn down a promotion. This is Prue's motto, thanks to which he is able to leave work on time every day. You don't have to drag yourself around corporate parties where you have to grovel before petty bosses, and since there's no chance of getting a big project afterwards, there's less stress too. Jacob ironically called himself a lazy person. This job is ideal for him, and he will continue to follow his path. Steve smiled, stating that he remembered well the alcohol he drank with his elder. Since they would be crossing paths often, they could have a drink. Steve bowed to the elder, saying that next time he would treat him to one. Jacob bowed back, smiling and saying he would take it as an honor. Steve finally remembered John Wilson standing behind them with a twisted face. The man deliberately shook out the fabric of his jacket where the hand of his hated colleague lay. He gritted his teeth, trying not to scream, while Steve said that it was time for him to go and turned to leave. Finally, the time came to meet the company's president, Michael Jordan. Steve went into his office and introduced himself. The man said that it was mutual, although, in fact, they already knew each other. The smiling man reminded them that they had already met at the wedding of President Martin Evans and offered to have a cup of coffee. The interlocutor agreed and sat down in one of the comfortable chairs standing nearby. Michael took a sip and announced that, as Steve already knew, the appointment needed to be made urgently. But he felt that they should get to know each other better before that, so Jordan arranged a meeting with Steve, and at the same time, it was worth discussing the terms of the executive agreement. Steve also reminded me that he had to be at the distribution office at 5. Michael smiled. He didn't have much time either, so a short introduction would be enough to start with. But Steve suddenly objected, saying that he was proposing to do things differently. The man asked permission to set up a meeting with Senior Manager Robert Johnson right away. Michael did not hide that he was surprised by such a request, especially the fact that it was here and now. As soon as Steve was informed of the promotion, he wanted to meet with Senior Manager Robert before officially taking over. Michael cautiously asked why such an unpleasant meeting would be necessary. But Steve knew that if he didn't do what he had to do, just because it was unpleasant, it would only get worse. Then he will have to face an even more unpleasant situation. Jordan took a sip of his coffee, wondering what this unpleasant situation was. Steve was appointed head of the department by the senior chairman, and if his first task was to destroy evidence of the former department head's misdeeds, the president would not like what followed. Because Steve will ask Johnson to erase the traces he left before he takes office again. Michael nodded and picked up the phone. Steve reminded him that he had asked for records of hotel employees in European destinations and asked if his request had been passed on. The president called Robert and informed Steve about it, adding that he had prepared everything. The man turned and handed his subordinate a heavy folder of documents. Steve thanked him and sat back down in his chair, picking up a pen to make reading more comfortable. The documents surprised the secretary. His face lengthened, and he barely restrained himself from screaming. It turned out that only those who he considered truly competent employees quit. On the other hand, there was Harry Liu, who was well-versed in office politics and played a key role in Steve's discord with his colleagues. He was recently appointed manager of the third team in the Spanish division, namely the branch in Madrid. There was a knock on the door. Steve flinched slightly and already realized who was standing there. The door opened and Robert Johnson appeared on the threshold, asking if he had been called. Michael smiled good-naturedly, urging him not to expect trouble since his superiors had called him in. Robert glanced sideways at Steve sitting next to him, swallowed hard and nodded. Steve didn't even look at him, continuing to silently read the documents. Johnson had no choice but to sit down in the chair at the table opposite his former subordinate. He tried to start a conversation, coughed awkwardly, and the man said that he hadn't seen the senior manager for a long time. He thought that such a designation meant that the man was showing the remnants of his pride. Then he can most effectively assert his position by using the chairman as his advantage.
After a brief silence, Steve stated that he had heard from the senior chairman that Johnson was being transferred to Cheonggi.
The interlocutor lowered his head, and Steve continued that before the transfer, he wanted to ask for a favor. Deputy John Wilson and manager Harry Liu, Steve wanted Robert to fire the two before transferring to Cheonggi. This statement truly shocked the man. He almost jumped up from his seat. He, unable to contain himself, screamed hysterically, asking the same question. But Steve was cold and unapproachable, and he offered to repeat what Robert had said if he wanted. He asked Johnson to completely erase their traces and leave nothing of their activities during the period when Steve worked for the company. The man turned green with anger, clenching his teeth and clenching his fists. He hissed through his teeth that he was transferring to Cheonggi next week.
Then he shouted that Steve was not even asking for a suspension, a demotion, or even administrative leave, but for the firing of good employees, which is not so easy in practice.
Michael remained silent the entire time and did not comment on what had happened, savoring his coffee. Steve, however, calmly replied that Johnson had misunderstood him. Even though it's called a request, right now, his former subordinate is giving him a chance. The man's eyes widened, not understanding what kind of chance they were talking about. Steve looked down and nodded towards the documents lying on the table. No matter why Robert was transferred to another company, only 6 months had passed since his promotion to director. Despite the transfer, the employee still had to work for another 6 months. Steve pressed him to ask if Johnson would be okay with such a shameful termination of his employment contract. When he takes office, if these two are under his jurisdiction, what should be done then? It would be impossible to be magnanimous and continue to work with them. Then Steve would have to deal with them himself, but there was no reason for that. Should we raise the issue of the contract with the Andalusian farmers again, or the confirmed proposal to establish a branch in Madrid? Robert hung his head low, clasping his hands in his lap, listening to all this. Steve shook his head, because he knew and understood what would happen if he did that. Anyone who has been promoted to department head by taking over the responsibilities of their subordinate and then also to director will seriously damage Mulson's image within trade partners. Steve was determined, looking his opponent straight in the eye as he sat across from him. Johnson was only 40 years old and rose quickly through the ranks. But no matter where a man moves, he will still have to work one way or another. And what will happen if he resigns after just 6 months, given such a complicated history? In this country, where everyone is constantly talking about the great company, trade partners, it doesn't matter whether Robert starts his own business or tries to find a new job. Steve's eyes widened, not taking his gaze off the dejected man, cutting off that this wouldn't be easy. Robert had been looking at his own shoes for several minutes while his interlocutor was speaking. Finally, when Steve fell silent, he raised his cup of coffee to his lips and took a sip. He turned to Michael, saying that he had finished, and he said that the man could sign the employment contract on the day he officially returned to work, but that would be next week. Steve agreed to the condition and slowly rose from his chair. He looked at Director Johnson, who suddenly raised his head. The man looked like a beaten animal. Steve looked at his interlocutor with disdain, thanking him for his hard work. And also, as if he had given the finishing touches, he wished for a peaceful demotion. Earlier, Eliza asked her manager to help her choose a suit for Steve. The girl folded her arms across her chest, critically examining the man in his expensive attire. He turned around at the director's request, asking if anything else needed to be changed. Seeing Eliza's displeased look, the manager immediately became embarrassed, lowering his eyes to the floor. The girl shook her head, rightly noting that the men's physiques were similar, but their faces were completely different. If you imagine the body of a manager, but with the face of Steve's deputy, you get an absurd combination. Immediately after this, the girl abandoned her idea and returned to the office. After meeting with the president of the trading company, Steve went to see Eliza. The girl's manager immediately noticed the man near the elevator and perked up. He greeted the deputy, and Steve greeted him back, standing in front of the desk. Eliza's secretary looked closely at the manager and asked in surprise if something had happened. It seemed that the manager himself did not even notice the dark circles under his eyes from lack of sleep and frozen bewilderment. Steve said the man looked very tired and now had bags under his eyes, which the manager didn't expect to hear. Steve decided to change the subject and asked where the director was. She was already waiting for him in her office. The man knocked on the door and opened it slightly, making his presence known. Eliza was genuinely glad to see her assistant. She was just reading some kind of brochure. The girl asked if the meeting with President Jordan had gone smoothly. Eliza put the brochure down and put on her jacket, asking why he wanted to meet. Since Steve had been unexpectedly transferred to Mulsanne, he called the man over to introduce him to the executives in advance. Eliza shook her head as her deputy opened the door to let the director in. The girl told the manager that she would leave early today and praised him for his good work. The man bowed and asked if he needed to accompany the boss. Eliza perked up, remembering that she had forgotten something important, and agreed to the offer. When the three of them were in the elevator, Steve glanced sideways at the manager, not understanding why he had gone with them. The girl looked at Steve and asked how the vice president and the department head were doing. He replied that he had not yet met them. Eliza was surprised because the secretary said that this was precisely why the president had called him. Steve will introduce himself to them after he officially takes office, but has already asked to meet with Director Robert Johnson. He needed to bring the man up to speed. The only opportunity was today. Eliza chuckled and shook her head, smiling slightly as she replied that she understood. As the three of them left the building, Steve looked in bewilderment at the manager, who rushed to the car. The silent assistant opened the trunk and took out a number of heavy packages. Eliza asked Steve to help her move the bags into the car because they were heavier than they looked. A few minutes later, thanks to both men, the purchases were in the director's car. The manager took his leave, saying that if he was no longer needed, he would return to work. The girl asked him to change his plans and finish the work as quickly as possible. Eliza opened the car, and Steve asked if she wanted to take him somewhere. She sat down and buckled up, replying that she needed to check the house now. Steve continued to stand, not understanding what they wanted from him. Eliza sighed and asked him to sit down, saying that she would explain everything on the way. The girl said that she had found a house for them not far from her parents in a small town, built by the Mulsanne company. Looking out the window, she added that this was another part of their suite performance. Steve will ask if they are talking about the Remium residential complex now. Eliza has never been there before. The man nodded, then asked what kind of bags were in the trunk. Eliza explained that she had stopped by the store and bought several pairs of suits and shoes, as Steve would be becoming a director who would take on a management position, so she had decided to take charge of the clothing issue. The man was confused, but still thanked them. Rather, the navigator announced that the couple had arrived at their destination. Steve entered the house and was stunned by surprise. So impressed was he by what he saw. The space literally shone. The home's design was thought out down to the smallest detail. Eliza silently looked around the room, assessing it, but Steve could not remain silent, making sounds of admiration. The girl said that she always wakes up at 4:30 in the morning, no matter how tired she is. She will also need a kitchen so as not to wake up her future husband because of this, so she will occupy the first floor, and he the second. Eliza asked Steve's opinion, but he was so absorbed in the house that he only mumbled something unintelligible. The girl nervously tugged at the man's sleeve, asking him what he thought, and only then did the future groom answer that everything was fine. Eliza walked over to the large panoramic window, thoughtfully saying that that's what they would do. She looked into the distance and suddenly began talking about her appointment as director of the European division at Mulsanne. Steve was asked if Director Robert Johnson had anything to do with the man wanting the job. He looked at the floor, asking the girl what she meant. She just smiled. Steve frowned, slightly nervous, as he carefully asked Eliza if she knew anything. Eliza herself continued speaking, mentioning Robert Johnson and John Wilson. The girl shook her head, quietly saying that she should have found out about Steve earlier. After all, he was removed, and the man pretended that nothing had happened. Was he even a little upset? When the girl first saw the deputy, she thought he was charming, but she couldn't understand how he knew what she was asking and when he had time to prepare. The team clearly avoided him, but he never complained. The man's incredible tenacity was immediately evident. It is obvious that the secretary could have asked the director for help, but he never did this. After all, he knows how to keep his mouth shut. He has a meaningful sense of pride and loyalty to the company.
That's why Eliza thought he was the perfect candidate.
Rather than let him wither away without recognition, she decided to take the man with her when she was transferred to the distribution department. Eliza watered the man like a plant and allowed him to become indispensable to her. He was the one who could read her desires at a glance and guess them, and then fulfill them. She lured Steve to her side. The director smiled and said that she apologized if he felt uncomfortable. She also added that it was a good idea to report Director Johnson. It doesn't matter how long ago it happened, because the only son-in-law of her family is forbidden to be spineless. He owes revenge for what others have done to him, that's for sure. And Eliza didn't need to know about it. She was sure that the man had figured it out himself. The girl thanked him for taking care of this in advance. Steve glanced sideways at the girl, realizing that he was now finally convinced of his decision, then clenched his fists. After all, it wasn't money that prompted him to accept this marriage proposal. The man wants to devote himself entirely to Director Eliza Evans so that he can always be there. After all, she was the only one who believed in Steve at first sight. The next day, a long red carpet was rolled out in the large room, with security guards standing on both sides. Steve, dressed in one of the expensive suits Eliza had bought him, walked across the carpet. He was greeted loudly, which surprised the director's former secretary. Steve was surprised by such a welcoming ceremony in the lobby. He would never have thought that he would become a participant in one of Trade's partners' traditions. On the way to the office, the director of the European department was blocked by a man who looked to be in his early 40s. It was Director David Smith, head of the overseas department. The man bowed politely, and Steve looked at him carefully, remembering the name. He had no supporters at Mulsanna, but he played a key role in building the overseas branch focused on the Middle East and became a legendary figure in the company. Suddenly the world turned black. Steve was standing at the panoramic window in the new house. Eliza was nearby. She asked not to be afraid. The man jerked in fear, asking who was next to him, and only then saw Eliza. She nodded, saying that her secretary could simply behave the same way she did. Then the girl shook her head for some reason and pointed at herself again. We need to think about how Eliza would act in this situation and always maintain the image of the head of Mulsanne. And then think, how would Steve clean up this mess? You have to keep these thoughts in your head. If we think alike, then from this moment the couple will cease to be two separate people. There will be two Elizas, and also the two Steves. For everyone else, they will become a symbol of hope. There is nothing to be afraid of here. You just have to go and destroy them all. Remembering this, Steve smiled at David, thanking him for coming. He was counting on Smith's continued support and cooperation, and he reported that the president and manager were now in the conference room. After shaking his interlocutor's hand, Steve thought about how Eliza would act now. He asked if he could briefly visit the European regional office beforehand. The man behind him perked up, asking in surprise if this needed to be done right now. Preparations for the director's speech are already complete, and there is no time to waste. Steve interrupted the stranger's speech by raising his hand and showing his palm to the stranger. He looked very stern as he announced that it would not be long and that the assistant could go up to the conference room first. David smiled. He wanted to go together. A lot of time had passed. Steve would probably enjoy looking around the European regional office. As soon as they entered, the hum of the employees suddenly died down and everyone turned toward the doors. The workers began to look around and whisper when Steve entered. He walked up to one of the tables and froze, looking at the work area. The director called manager Noah to him, and he came running at the call. The man asked if John Wilson had sat at this table before. Steve turned to assistant manager Jacob Prue, who was sitting behind the screen. He smiled, now asking his director what was the matter. Steve said bluntly that the man needed to gather his things and come here. Jacob was taken aback and at first thought he had misheard, but the director was absolutely serious. Since the office was open, all the other employees immediately turned around with interest at the sound of the voices. Steve firmly stated that from now on, the assistant manager's position would be here. The man immediately saw a guy at a small table who immediately said hello. Director Eliza appointed the guy as Steve's personal secretary. He bowed, saying that he was looking forward to starting work with his new boss and that today was his first day. Steve praised the guy for settling into his new place and asked if he had anything scheduled for today. Harry replied that nothing had been transmitted yet, which meant the day would be easy. He also remembered that the head of the secretarial department was waiting for Steve inside. He perked up, mentally preparing himself for an important meeting that he had not expected. Taking a deep breath and exhaling, the man entered the office, greeting the director. Director Leo has served Chairman Tom Evans for a long time, and they are very close. He smiled and said that it seemed like Steve's first day had been something of an initiation. He handed the new director a red packet, asking him to accept the gift from the chairman. The chairman also asked to find out if Steve was free for lunch tomorrow, and he nodded. Suddenly, Leo looked at Steve carefully, calling his name. The man asked what was the matter and was a little surprised by such close attention. Leo said that champagne can only be opened after a victory. There is no need to rush to drink it. It is worth waiting for the right moment. Don't open it just because it's a gift from the chairman. Leo has seen many people make that mistake. The man smiled, urging him not to drink the champagne immediately after receiving it. Steve smiled politely back, thanking him for the advice. He asked the director to sit down, but he refused, citing duties that needed to be performed. Once the lunch location is chosen, Leo will immediately ask the secretary to inform Steve. Steve offered coffee, but Leo, tired of waiting, had already drunk a cup with David Smith. Steve realized that the man had probably already had a good conversation with the manager, David. He noticed the flowers standing in the corner of the table. One of them had Martin Evans' name written on a large ribbon. The man immediately remembered the stately president and fell into deep thought. What can you expect from a man like Martin? The next day, Leo called Steve and said that Tom had already arrived. The man quickly collected his thoughts and went to the meeting. Although he arrived 20 minutes early, he decided that it was not worth keeping the chairman waiting. Entering the hall, Steve saw that not only Tom Evans was sitting at the table, but also Eliza. The man sat with his hands clasped, looking seriously at his future son-in-law. The director looked calm, and as always, beautiful, and obediently placed her hands on the table. Steve, as expected, bowed and greeted those present. He straightened up, and the chairman immediately called his name. The man pointed to an empty seat, saying that he had been hearing the new director's name all last week. He extended his hand as well, and Steve extended his, stepping closer. They shook hands, and Tom expressed his congratulations on his promotion to director. Steve promised that he would do his best not to disappoint him. The manager noted that it was okay if he was disappointed, but he hoped that the man would keep his promise and try. Tom said that he had already ordered food and invited Steve to sit down. A few minutes later, the guests were served appetizers and hot dishes, and everyone began to eat and talk. The chairman asked why Steve had worked so hard even before he officially took office. The man shook his head confidently, saying that if everyone applying for the position did the same, they wouldn't have to put up with the problems that were arising in the European department. Because of what happened between him and the former director, Steve had to calm the unrest among the employees affected. Tom suggested that Steve's actions hadn't made the situation any easier. From the employee's point of view, the most alarming time is when something is about to explode but hasn't yet. And as everyday life goes on as usual, once the explosion finally happens, they will be surprised at first. But then, as Steve thought, his heart would definitely feel lighter. It was the same with him, as it seems to him, he cut off all the rotten parts that needed to be removed. The father and daughter looked in surprise at Steve, who said that from now on, he would apply medicine to the wounds, and that this would help something new and healthy grow. This answer really satisfied the chairman. He smiled. The man nodded and asked if Steve's mother knew about Eliza. Steve was surprised, but didn't show it, replying that he had told him everything. Tom then asked if the future husband planned to introduce the girl to his mother. Steve immediately looked at Eliza. This did not escape the chairman's attention, and he directly drew attention to what had happened because he wanted to hear Steve's opinion. But suddenly, the man hesitated and fell silent, confused, completely unsure of what to say. Finally, he awkwardly said that he really would like to. Tom was no less confused. He found it strange. After all, Steve had proven himself to be a confident person, but he answered quite constrainedly. He frowned and asked if Steve was being forced into this marriage. Tom shook his head, saying that given Eliza's character, the groom had suffered a lot. He knew that.
But the process is already over because the girl even found a house for them.
The man raised an eyebrow, asking if that was all the confidence Steve could muster. Does he think he's being asked questions just to get vague answers? Eliza decided to protect her future husband by telling her father that he was again twisting the meaning of words to his advantage. She was genuinely angry, asking her father if he thought Principal Steve was comfortable with the situation, so stop picking. Everyone got the point. The man pressed his lips into a thin line, looking at his daughter, and said nothing more. Then Steve himself took the floor, loudly and confidently saying that he would like to introduce his mother and bride, but he, of course, couldn't force the director to do this. He didn't want to rush. This surprised the chairman, to which Steve replied that the girl needed to be more careful with relationships than he did. Eliza glanced at the secretary, who was saying that there were still many things that needed to be taken care of. No matter how strong Steve's feelings are, he must wait until Principal Evans says it's time, and act only after she has made an informed decision. 3 years and 3 months. That's how long the man helped the executive director, and his intentions have not changed. Steve's immediate supervisor at Trade Partners, past, present, and future, will remain executive director Eliza Evans. Tom shook his head. Even if he was against this marriage, it would not stop Steve. Apparently, that was what the secretary wanted to say. Steve put his hand on his chest, declaring that unless the CEO told him to stop, he would not give up on the relationship. The chairman threw up his hands. After all, he couldn't hold his daughter, who was ready for marriage, in his arms forever, so he wouldn't teach the couple anymore. Tom's face probably smiled for the first time, and he suggested they have some wine. The waiter immediately came over and opened the expensive bottle, pouring out a sparkling liquid. The father gave his daughter his permission to go and meet the mother of Steve, the executive director, as soon as possible. He then asked how quickly the executive director had settled into his new job, and he replied that as quickly as possible. Tom Evans suggested that there were some things that needed to be done before starting work. How carefully Steve handles everything will determine how trade partners perceive him, and more importantly, will public opinion about marrying Eliza change? Steve promised that he remembered the instructions and looked at the chairman with gratitude. Meanwhile, at Trade Partners, Robert Johnson was furious at his hopeless situation. The man pounded his fists on the table, shouting that he had nothing to do but quit. He stood up abruptly from the table, banging on the table. The assistant was frightened, trying to calm the manager down. Robert roughly pushed the guy away from him, ordering him to follow. Deputy Director Robert Johnson was originally slated to be promoted to director, and the appointment of manager Harry Liu as deputy director of the overseas branch has already been confirmed. Johnson was the leading candidate for the deputy position that was about to become vacant. But it all turned out to be a complete nonsense. Suddenly, the assistant manager, Jacob Prue, appeared. After all, when you appoint a director, you need to study the atmosphere in the office, the status of projects, and financial volumes. Johnson shouted that Jacob had been promoted to deputy director simply on a whim, without understanding everything. Prue heard the accusatory speeches. Robert continued to shout that Jacob was not a god and not a chairman. Was he really playing with toys in a sandbox? The man must have become hysterical and continued shouting that there was no point in this. What the hell did Robert do wrong to get dragged into this mess? He worked at this job for 7 years, and he worked so hard all this time. It was a rigged game where they took everything for themselves. Even in this game, Johnson gave up his pride. Watching Deputy Smith get promoted first, even congratulated him, thought he would be next. Robert slammed his fists on the table again, screaming that there was nothing more he could do. Jacob couldn't listen to all this anymore and abruptly opened the desk drawer where the cigarettes and lighter were. The man quickly put them in his pocket, standing in front of the table for a few more seconds. At the elevator, the man was met by an acquaintance who loudly exclaimed his name. He greeted him back, and the manager smiled and noted that Jacob was going for a smoke break and reading minds. He excitedly recounted that he had just been discussing Jacob's unexpected promotion with other colleagues. He blushed and felt like he urgently needed to justify himself to everyone. He quickly pressed the button for the first floor, saying that he was going to the store to buy something. The pushy manager smiled broadly, wanting to smoke together and hear the gossip firsthand. But Prue still insistently repeated that he needed to leave, and that the rest of them should go for a smoke break. Having freed himself from the persistent manager, Jacob went to the restroom, and there, having locked himself in a stall, he was able to breathe a sigh of relief. He took a cigarette out of his pocket and brought it to his lips, but then he remembered something. Jacob pulled out his cell phone from his other pocket, finding the contact information for Steve's deputy. The filter of the unlit cigarette began to wet his mouth as the man decided whether to call or not. At this time, the newly appointed director himself was working diligently in his office. Charlie knocked on the door, and when he was allowed in, he looked into the office. John Wilson asked on the phone if the director would spare him some time. Steve agreed, also asking the secretary to offer coffee to the guest. Soon John arrived in the office. The director asked what brought the man there. He looked really nervous. He couldn't quite articulate what he was thinking and began to stutter, awkwardly looking at his feet. Finally making up his mind, John said he wanted to talk about promoting assistant manager Jacob Prue to deputy director. Steve reminded that this had been approved and announced by the head of human resources. The man swallowed hard, betting that the staff had reacted very poorly. Steve wondered when the European department had become so democratic. Apparently, they would tell him now that promotions should also be decided by a staff vote. The director then concluded that it was sad, probably because the discontent was so strong that John came here. Wilson looked down sharply, replying that it was indeed so. Then Steve asked what he thought about it and whether he agreed with the team. He raised an eyebrow, wondering if John was just feeling better because of the personnel changes. The man recalled that he gave the director of the department many additional opportunities. He did not dare look his interlocutor in the eyes, thanking him and assuring him that he felt better. But at the same time, he couldn't understand why the atmosphere in the office was so tense. Steve wondered if he should take everyone's opinions into account before making a decision. Then he should be working in the European Regional Department, not here. John tried to object, already coming up with many arguments in his head. Steve smiled condescendingly and began talking to the director as if he were a child. As the head, he has authority over all personnel matters within the European Regional Department. Steve pressed John on whether he agreed with that statement. The man lowered his eyes in shame, clutching his trouser legs with his palms, agreeing with this. Within the scope of these powers, Steve makes every effort to fulfill his duties. Then he asked with interest, what about Director John? Steve tapped his pen on the documents he was reading and sternly told him that he didn't understand the director's role. Or if he doesn't know what authority he has, have him leave the minimum number of employees necessary for basic operations in the office for an hour and gather the staff of the European Regional Department in a conference room. Wilson asked hoarsely what this was for. Steve stated that he would sort everything out himself, considering that this was the first case, he would handle it himself. But if Steve is now expected to maintain the office atmosphere in addition to his main job, then what is the purpose of a director? Finally, Steve ordered John to go immediately and prepare everything. He would return later. Wilson did not dare disobey, and soon people were gathered in the conference room, and the director was already standing behind the podium. All the heads of departments were gathered here. John glanced sideways at the most hated person. Jacob sat away from him, his arms crossed over his chest and his eyes fixed on the floor. Steve began his speech by greeting everyone and grasping the edge of the podium with his hand. He reported that Director Wilson had come to his office about an hour ago. He noted that the mood in the office had worsened due to personnel changes. But the former chairman also asked why the man tries to ignore employee complaints. Assistant manager Jacob Prue was promoted to deputy manager, and the president and CEO of the department told Steve what he thought was right. The man noticed that he did what he was ordered to do. When the director came to meet Steve, he was truly touched. It was clearly not easy for him to come, but he took responsibility for the mood and teamwork in the entire European department. When Steve mentioned the company's stability, John covered his eyes with his hand in dismay. There's always something valuable in employee complaints. You just need to know how to use it effectively. The validity of these complaints definitely needs to be questioned. But suddenly the manager asked himself a question. After all, John Wilson, the deputy, was scheduled to be promoted to director. If he gets promoted to director in August, what will happen to Director Noah? Steve immediately added that he was asking because he didn't know. He suddenly turned to Manager Bob, which horrified Wilson. And I asked him, as the most experienced manager of the European Regional Department, to explain this. After all, if you think realistically, getting a director's position is not easy. So it turns out that voluntary resignation is the only way out. Is this opinion already established? Steve turned again to Manager Bob, who was visibly nervous. He then asked whether the department considered the planned promotion of Manager John Wilson to director to be logical and obvious. He was told that this was all because the Spanish team's billing figures were transparent, and that the previous director had started this process, so the department couldn't say anything. Steve asked why there was such a fuss about Deputy Jacob Prue's promotion. Was the problem really that he missed 2 promotion steps? Now, we need to wait until the most important factor breaks down and the mood changes to fear of Steve. And that's why he asked if the problem was that he was the one who promoted Jacob. He then continued speaking, clearly and slowly, emphasizing each word. Was there a problem because someone missed their chance for a promotion, because of his decision? Wilson could no longer remain silent and endure the general humiliation. He cried out that he understood, and that was all there was to it. The man wanted to say something about Assistant Manager Jacob Prue. Steve corrected him by saying that he was already deputy manager. John clenched his fist and asked for forgiveness, promising to improve. The director suddenly asked Steve what percentage of the total billing volume was cryptocurrency for the European Regional Department and if he knew it. He immediately replied that it was about 2%. Promotion from an assistant manager to a deputy manager overseeing the Central European Regional Department, without any overall personal achievements, bypassing 2 positions. This can be regarded as arbitrary personnel management. Steve nodded, saying he understood that John couldn't accept it. He tapped his finger on the edge of the podium, wondering how he could explain it so that people would understand him. However, Steve again turned to Manager Bob, who responded immediately. The man gave him a rather meaningful look, asking if he needed to do this. Besides Jacob's manager, should he get consent from everyone? Steve raised an eyebrow, wondering why he even needed to know what percentage of the total billing volume was in cryptocurrency for the European Regional Department. After all, a manager doesn't just give out orders and check the results of the given instructions. It analyzes current conditions and identifies cause and effect relationships. This is exactly what office staff should be doing, isn't he right? And what does arbitrary personnel management mean? Is Trade Partners a government agency? Maybe Steve is a civil servant or a politician. Why is arbitrary personnel management a problem? In such an organization, the one who is obliged to take responsibility for his decisions and has the right, if necessary, to make choices at his own discretion is a person. His position is called Executive Director. Those who are now unhappy with the promotion of Deputy Chief Executive Jacob Prue are questioning the decisions of the management. Steve raised his voice, also asking if there were any doubts about his abilities. But in the abilities of the chairman of Trade Partners, who appointed Steve to this position. The leaders who had been arguing with him were now silent, clasping their fingers together. The next person Steve turned to was Deputy Jacob. The man immediately made his presence known by answering loudly. Steve kindly asked Prue to stand up for a second. He stood up and was asked what Jacob himself thought about the current situation. Jacob smiled slightly, asking if he could speak honestly. Steve smiled back, saying that was possible. Prue said that he walked his path alone, the path of exile. Being an outcast at his age was ridiculous. It hurt his pride, so the man preferred to think that he turned away from everyone himself. But we need to understand that there must be some kind of limit, some kind of boundary. An intern who arrived much later than he did, for example, had to pretend that everything was fine. It hurt when he became a manager faster, but Jacob still smiled and congratulated him. Is it really so hard to say even such empty words as, "Sir, congratulations on your promotion"? Jacob looked very depressed and offended. He did not understand why he could not say at least one sentence. He admitted that he was going to call the director yesterday because he doubted his abilities and therefore wanted to ask him to reconsider his decision. But suddenly a feeling of protest arose within him. and the man changed his mind about doing what he had planned. At that moment, for some reason, a new solution appeared in my head. Refusing such a chance would mean that Jacob admitted what he had said before. So Prue hid the phone and didn't call. The man bowed, thanking Steve for giving him the wonderful opportunity to prove himself. He would also like to say something to the European Regional Department. When it's all over and they all return to the office, let them approach him as if nothing had happened in the last 3 years. They should come up and say, "Deputy, congratulations on your promotion." Steve was satisfied with the employee's speech and smiled. At the dinner, the chairman praised CEO Steve for his extraordinary people management skills. The man asked how many days he spent in the company. Tom replied that it had only been 10 days counting today, and during that time he had brought the huge European Regional Department under his control, and immediately entered into competition for results with a foreign construction branch. Eliza ate silently, listening to her elders and smiling only slightly. George asked Tom to invite Steve to their dinner, which caused his son's indignation. He was sure that Eliza should first meet the groom's family, but the chairman wanted to invite the man not as his granddaughter's partner, but as an employee who worked hard in his company. The manager chuckled. He heard that this guy looked like him. Eliza was surprised and asked what exactly. It turned out that Steve would achieve what he wanted by any means necessary. "And he will do it to feel satisfied," Eliza smiled, countering that Steve wasn't like her grandfather. In her opinion, this man does not yet know what he really wants. The girl needs to hint to him. He is one of those who will make it happen by any means necessary. Yes, her CEO, Steve, was just such a person. The next day when she met Steve, Eliza folded her arms across her chest, looking at her fiancé with displeasure. She had thought that this was exactly what the executive director was like. The man was confused and asked the girl what she meant. Eliza asked irritably if she had bought too many clothes for Steve. It's obvious that this yellow tie doesn't go with the suit at all. Eliza ordered that, starting tomorrow, photos of his appearance be taken and sent to her so that Steve will receive a work permit. The man raised an eyebrow, asking if this was a joke, but the girl was not joking at all. Eliza straightened her future husband's tie. 3 years of endless reproaches and not the slightest progress. The girl ran her hand over Steve's jacket, saying that they were going to the department store. That evening, Steve stood in full dress with Eliza Evans's family, wearing a new tie. The chairman greeted the guest warmly, asking why he was so modest. The whole family was sitting at a richly laid table. The head of the company asked the man to sit next to them. Steve sat down next to Eliza and immediately noticed that Vice President Martin Evans and his wife were not there. The chairman, like an ordinary grandfather, kindly urged everyone to eat and take their time. He looked at Steve, suddenly saying that it must have been incredibly hard for him all this time. The man did not expect the conversation to start in such a way and did not hide his surprise. George smiled, saying that what Steve wanted to do and that he was really good at it. The old man sincerely regretted that he had not noticed him earlier. Steve thought the chairman wasn't usually so generous with praise, so he said out loud that everything was fine. But George didn't stop anymore. The next thing he asked was about the fatigue of constantly following Eliza. Steve replied just as briefly that this was not true at all. Then he smiled warmly, admitting that he would appreciate this time incredibly. George was glad to hear this, and asked his son-in-law if he really thought so, and he nodded. For 3 years and 3 months, Steve commuted to work at Trade Partners. This time turned out to be the most significant in all the years of the man's life. A world that many are interested in, but only a few experience. Thanks to Executive Director Eliza, Steve was able to touch it. Without this opportunity, he would not have even dared to consider the position of director in a trading company. George raised his spoon to his mouth, listening to such revelations, and smiled. He said that Steve had received a position, his status had changed. But still the man said that the desire to help Eliza remained unchanged. Is that true, now? The old man didn't look at Steve while he spoke, but he knew he was hanging on his every word. After all, within the framework of the new project, its only leader is Eliza, and this is how it is and will continue to be. Steve, of course, didn't object, and only confirmed the seriousness of his intentions. But suddenly George looked at him and asked what about him. Steve was confused and asked what the chairman meant. He explained that if he and Eliza gave completely different orders at the same time, would the girl be a priority? This is how the executive director's grandfather cunningly decided to find out about the debtor's loyalty. He thought for a few seconds, then replied that he was only following orders. Well, it is the owner of the company he works for who leads in everything, comparing this to the direction of a boat and its owner, who sets the speed. He was a rower, and the owner of the boat the man was in was the executive director, Eliza. George was very amused by this comparison and began to laugh. Then the head of the family turned to his son, Tom. At first, my father suggested having a drink on such a day, then at the table, and then the conversation flowed on to everyday topics. When dinner was over, Steve and Eliza were walking along the illuminated path in the garden. The girl asked the groom if he was even a little worried. She admitted that she didn't expect such straightforwardness from Steve. It didn't matter what she thought about it, but the man was too valuable to give to anyone. Steve asked if Eliza was cold, but she waved her hand because who would freeze from the spring wind in April? The man admitted that he told his mother about her pickiness. Eliza stared at Steve in bewilderment and even stopped. He smiled and admitted that he had already told his mother about the girl a long time ago. She sighed and asked how long ago this had happened. Steve remembered that it seemed to have happened when the girl came to the company as a manager. Most people brag about it like they're the celebrity next door. The girl was surprised to notice that work is usually not discussed at home. But Steve's mother was his only family, and he shared everything with her. Eliza smiled and guessed that her mother was probably very surprised that her son was marrying a celebrity. He told his mother that Eliza relied on him for work matters and asked him for help. The girl scratched her neck, confirming that this was indeed the case. But Steve said he said that when he was the girl's deputy, back when he was working in sales. His mother had no idea that her son was having a hard time in the company. She thought that Steve became deputy, not by his own will, but after Eliza's persuasion. The girl looked with interest at her future husband, who said that he had no choice. He thought he wanted to reassure his mother, even if it was a lie, but Eliza noticed that the director had a soft side. That's why Steve voluntarily confesses to her. A few seconds later, he invited Eliza to visit his mother this week. The girl thought about it and said that she could do it on Saturday. So, the meeting took place. Eliza, smiling radiantly, greeted Steve's mother, introducing herself, saying that she was glad to meet him. The woman reciprocated. She was worried that her daughter-in-law had brought so much to the table. She pointed to a modest room, inviting them to come in quickly. Steve shook his head, thinking that his mother had things too perfectly organized. Eliza asked if there was anything she could do to help, but Steve's mother shook her head, telling him not to worry. She asked the guests to make themselves comfortable on the sofa, as the food was already ready. The girl nevertheless asked permission to help set the table. She politely asked why Steve's mother had prepared so much. The woman replied that if guests were coming from far away, she simply had to prepare well. Eliza later politely asked if she could take certain plates. Steve came up from behind and decided to offer his help. Finally, after half an hour, the table was set, with many dishes and a large number of appetizers on it. The woman came out of the kitchen and suddenly threw up her hands, exclaiming that something had gone out of her head. Mom forgot to buy alcohol while she was cooking. Steve, who was apparently thinking about something of his own, turned around and asked again what was going on. The woman then confirmed that they should have a drink and sent her son to the store. When the door closed behind Steve, his mother sat down on the sofa and patted the seat next to her. She wasted no time in calling the executive director to her office. The woman asked, slightly embarrassed, if the girl could sit next to her. Eliza nodded and quickly walked over to the sofa, sitting down next to him. Steve's mother admitted that she deliberately did not buy alcohol for the table because she wanted to talk to Eliza alone. The girl urged her mother not to be shy and to speak. The woman chuckled, noting that it was a little awkward to address her by her job title. She would be more comfortable calling Eliza by her first name, and she agreed. She admitted that she was very worried when she found out about her son's party. She thought about closing her business because Steve would be looked down upon when they found out about his mother's store in a remote area. Although he said that everything was fine, the mother wanted to make sure of this from her daughter-in-law herself. Eliza was surprised by such thoughts. and the woman admitted that she was sorry that her parent could not boast of more. The girl waved her hands, urging her mother not to worry, because she and Steve were getting married because they liked each other and the family's past didn't matter. The mother sighed and carefully took her daughter-in-law's hand. She asked if her family thought the same and if they shared her daughter's opinion. She tilted her head to the side, asking what the woman meant. Since this wedding is because the young people like each other, won't Eliza's family burden Steve with questions about his family? Perhaps in that case they will prioritize the happiness of the young. Eliza said that she works hard for the company. The woman nodded. Then the girl smiled, saying that Steve worked even harder than she did,